A boy meets his newborn baby sister for the very first time. But the moment he looks at her, an uneasy chill runs down his spine. He steps back, shakes his head, and says, "That's not my sister." His parents laugh it off, thinking he's just jealous. But when the baby's cries take on an eerie, unnatural tone and strange symbols start appearing around the house, the family realizes something sinister is happening. Who or what is this baby? And how far will the boy go to uncover the truth? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the hospital waiting room, casting a harsh glow that made everything look too bright and too clean. Ethan Matthews drummed his fingers against the plastic armrest of his chair, his legs swinging back and forth without touching the floor. The clock on the wall seemed to move slower than usual, its red numbers changing at what felt like a snail's pace. "Want to play another round of 20 questions?" his father asked, looking up from his phone. Dark circles ringed his eyes, but his smile was warm and encouraging. Ethan shook his head. "No thanks, Dad." He'd already guessed pencil and airplane in their previous games, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. In just a few hours, he would be a big brother. The thought made his stomach flutter with a mix of excitement and worry. All around them, other families waited for their own news. An elderly couple held hands in the corner, whispering to each other. A young girl colored in a picture book while her father dozed beside her. The soft murmur of conversations and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on the linoleum floor filled the air. "Your mom's going to do great," his father said, reaching over to ruffle Ethan's dark hair. "Before you know it, you'll have a little sister to look after." Ethan tried to smile, but his mouth felt stiff. For months, his parents had talked about nothing else. They'd painted the nursery a soft yellow, filled it with stuffed animals, and hung a mobile with tiny silver stars above the crib. Everything was ready for the baby, but something about it all made Ethan's skin prickle with unease. The waiting room door swung open, and a nurse in blue scrubs appeared, her face bright with a smile. "Mr. Matthews, would you and your son like to meet the newest member of your family?" Ethan's father jumped to his feet, pulling Ethan up with him. They followed the nurse down a long hallway, their footsteps echoing against the walls. The smell of disinfectant grew stronger as they approached the maternity ward. Inside the room, Ethan's mother lay propped up against white pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her eyes shining. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a pink blanket. "Come meet your sister," she said softly. Ethan's father moved forward immediately, his eyes growing wet as he gazed down at the baby. But Ethan stayed rooted near the doorway, his heart beating faster than normal. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. "Come on, buddy," his father encouraged, motioning him closer. "Don't you want to say hello?" Each step forward felt heavy, like his shoes were filled with lead. When he finally reached the bedside, Ethan forced himself to look at the baby. She looked exactly like a newborn should, pink cheeks slightly puffy, a small tuft of dark hair peeking out from under her cap, tiny fingers curled into fists. But the moment he saw her, the uncomfortable feeling in his stomach grew into something close to panic. "This is your sister, Olivia," his mother said proudly, adjusting the blanket so Ethan could see her better. The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "That's not my sister." The room went completely still. His mother's smile faltered, and his father's hand tightened on his shoulder. "Ethan," his father said, his voice stern but quiet. "Don't be silly. Of course she's your sister." But Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the baby. She looked perfect, too perfect maybe, but something about her felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. He couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words that would make sense to his parents, but he knew it with absolute certainty. His mother's eyes filled with tears, and his father guided him to sit in a chair in the corner of the room. The joyful atmosphere had cracked, replaced by an awkward tension that no one seemed to know how to break. As his parents cooed over baby Olivia, Ethan sat quietly in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Every few seconds, his eyes would drift back to the bundle in his mother's arms, and that same sick feeling would wash over him. He didn't understand why he felt this way, but he couldn't shake the certainty that something wasn't right about his new sister. The glow-in-the-dark stars on Ethan's ceiling cast a faint greenish light across his bedroom. He lay in bed, arms crossed behind his head, unable to close his eyes. Every time he tried, he saw the image of baby Olivia in his mother's arms, and that same uncomfortable feeling would twist in his stomach. His parents' voices drifted up through the heating vent, muffled but clear enough to make out their words. "He's just adjusting," his mother said. "It's a big change for him." "Of course it is," his father agreed. "Remember how my sister acted when I was born? Mom said she wouldn't even look at me for a week." They laughed softly, but Ethan could hear the worry underneath. He rolled onto his side, pulling his blanket up to his chin. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just being silly, letting his imagination run wild like they always said he did. But no matter how many times he told himself that, the feeling wouldn't go away. The clock on his nightstand showed 11:42 p.m. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force himself to sleep. The house creaked and settled around him, familiar sounds that usually brought comfort, but tonight they seemed different, almost threatening. Finally, exhaustion won out over his racing thoughts. Ethan drifted off into an uneasy sleep, and the world around him transformed. He found himself in a forest unlike any he'd ever seen. The trees stretched impossibly tall, their branches twisted and gnarled like arthritic fingers reaching for the dark sky. No stars shone above, no moon lit his path. The ground beneath his feet felt spongy and wrong, like walking on something alive. The silence pressed against his ears until a sound cut through it, a baby crying. The wail echoed through the trees, bouncing back and forth until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he turned in circles trying to locate the source. There, through the trees, a darker shape against the darkness. Ethan moved toward it, branches catching at his pajamas like claws. The figure stood completely still, holding something in its arms. As Ethan drew closer, he could make out more details, though none of them made sense. The figure looked human-shaped, but its movements were wrong, like a puppet being controlled by inexperienced hands. Its head twitched at odd angles, and its arms bent in ways arms shouldn't bend. The crying grew louder. Ethan knew he should run, but his feet carried him forward anyway. He was close enough now to see the pink blanket in the figure's arms, the same blanket his mother had wrapped Olivia in at the hospital. The figure's head began to turn toward him, moving in jerky, unnatural stops and starts. Ethan wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Just as the figure's face came into view, Ethan shot upright in bed, gasping for air. His t-shirt clung to his skin, soaked with sweat. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. The dream had felt so real. He could still smell the musty scent of the forest, still feel the oppressive weight of the air around the figure. As his breathing began to slow, a sound cut through the quiet house. A baby's cry. Ethan's blood ran cold. The wail coming from Olivia's nursery down the hall sounded exactly like the cry from his dream. Exactly like it. The days after bringing Olivia home blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and constant adjustment. While his parents bustled around with bottles, diapers, and endless visits from cooing relatives, Ethan watched. He noticed things that others seemed to miss, details that made his skin prickle with unease. The first time he picked up on something truly wrong was during a quiet afternoon. His mother had finally fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from another night of feeding and changing. Olivia started to cry, but it wasn't the normal wail of a hungry baby. The sound pierced the air like crystal breaking, musical notes that seemed to form a pattern. Ethan froze in the hallway, his hand gripping the doorframe as he listened. The cry rose and fell in impossible ways, too controlled for a newborn. "Did you hear that?" he asked his father later that evening. "How weird her crying sounds." His father barely looked up from the pile of dishes in the sink. "All babies cry differently, buddy. You'll get used to it." But Ethan couldn't get used to it, especially not when Olivia started watching him. Every time he entered the nursery, her cries would stop abruptly. Her eyes, which should have been unfocused like most newborns, would lock onto him with startling clarity. She would track his movements across the room, her gaze steady and knowing in a way that made his stomach churn. Late one night, unable to sleep, Ethan heard his parents' voices drifting up from the kitchen. He crept to the top of the stairs, staying in the shadows as he listened. "I'm worried about him," his mother said, her voice tight with concern. "He barely talks anymore, and when he does, it's always about something being wrong with Olivia." "He's just jealous," his father replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "It's normal for kids his age. Remember what Dr. Peterson said about adjustment periods?" "This feels different." His mother's chair scraped against the floor. "The way he looks at her sometimes, like he's afraid of her. Should we talk to someone? A counselor, maybe?" Ethan retreated to his room, his chest tight. They wouldn't understand. How could he explain the way Olivia's eyes followed him? How her cries formed patterns that almost seemed like words? They'd just send him to talk to someone who would tell him he was imagining things. So he stayed quiet, watching and waiting. But Olivia's behavior grew more unsettling. When relatives visited, she acted like any other baby, unfocused eyes, random movements, normal crying. But the moment they left, she would turn her head and stare at Ethan, her awareness sharp and calculating. One afternoon, while his mother was doing laundry, Ethan stood in the nursery doorway. Olivia lay in her crib, apparently sleeping peacefully. Her tiny chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and for a moment she looked completely normal. Ethan almost convinced himself he had imagined everything. Then, just as he started to turn away, her eyes snapped open. They fixed on him immediately, clear and aware. The corner of her mouth twitched up in what could only be described as a smile, not the reflexive grimace of a newborn, but a deliberate knowing expression that sent chills racing down his spine. The arrival of Grandma Matthews brought a flurry of activity to the house. Her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, she swept through the front door with the confidence of someone who had raised 4 children of her own. Her familiar scent of lavender and fresh-baked cookies filled the entryway as she embraced each family member. While his parents gratefully accepted her help with household chores and baby duties, Ethan noticed something else about his grandmother. The way her dark eyes narrowed slightly whenever she looked at Olivia, how she would make the sign of the cross when no one was watching. On her 3rd day at the house, Grandma Matthews found Ethan alone in the kitchen. She settled into the chair beside him, her weathered hands folding carefully on the table. The morning sunlight streaming through the window caught the delicate gold wedding band she still wore, even years after Grandpa's passing. "Tell me about your sister," she said quietly, her accent thickening as it always did during serious conversations. Her voice carried traces of the old country, where such matters were taken more seriously. Ethan pushed his cereal bowl away, his appetite vanishing. The cornflakes had gone soggy anyway. "What do you want to know?" "What you really think," she replied, emphasizing the word really in a way that made Ethan's heart skip. "No pretending for my sake. I've seen too much in my life to judge." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, like water breaking through a dam. "She's not right, Grandma. She's not my sister. Not really." His voice shook as he described the unnatural cries, the too aware stares, the knowing smiles that no newborn should be capable of making. He told her about the shadows that seemed to dance around the crib, the way the temperature dropped whenever Olivia was upset. Instead of dismissing him or offering platitudes about jealousy, his grandmother listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each detail. Her fingers worked at her rosary beads, hidden in the pocket of her cardigan. When he finished, she reached out and squeezed his hand, her skin cool against his. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, glancing toward the hallway to ensure they were alone. "Something about our family history, something my mother told me, and her mother before her." She told him about the takers, creatures that lurked in shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to snatch newborns from their cribs. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon them. "They leave something else behind," she explained, her weathered hands trembling slightly. "Something that looks like the baby they took but isn't. The old ones called them changelings. In the old country, every village had stories." "Did you ever see one?" Ethan asked, leaning forward, his breakfast completely forgotten. His grandmother shook her head and the morning light caught the silver strands in her hair. I always thought they were just stories my mother told to keep us from wandering at night. But Olivia... She paused, choosing her words carefully, her fingers still working the rosary. The way she quiets when you're near, how her cries sometimes sound like whispered words. It reminds me of those old tales. And there's something in her eyes. Something old. Relief flooded through Ethan's body, making him feel lightheaded. Finally, someone believed him. Someone else could see what he saw. What do we do? Before his grandmother could answer, a cry pierced the air. That same crystalline sound that had been haunting Ethan's nights. His grandmother's face paled slightly, and she crossed herself again. They made their way to the nursery where his grandmother approached the crib with careful steps, as if treading on holy ground. She began humming an old lullaby, one Ethan remembered from his own childhood, when thunderstorms would frighten him. The melody filled the room with a gentle warmth, but Olivia's response was anything but gentle. Her cry cut through the lullaby like a knife through silk. Ethan watched as his grandmother extended her hand over Olivia's chest, not quite touching her. The old woman's fingers trembled, and her humming stopped abruptly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She turned to Ethan, her face ashen, all traces of her usual warmth gone. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice shaking, her accent thick with fear. "You were right. Something's not right at all. God help us all." The night wrapped around the house like a thick blanket, and Ethan lay in his bed, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The events of the day, his grandmother's revelations, the unsettling moments with Olivia, and the growing tension in the household weighed heavily on his mind. Through his partially open window, the gentle rustle of leaves mixed with Olivia's distant cries, creating an eerie lullaby that pulled him toward sleep despite his resistance. As consciousness slipped away, Ethan found himself back in the shadowy forest. The darkness felt deeper this time, more oppressive, as if the very air had substance. The twisted trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. Each step he took crushed dead leaves beneath his feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. The forest seemed to close in around him as he moved deeper into its depths. The branches swayed without wind, creating strange patterns in what little light filtered through the canopy. The air grew thick and cold, making each breath feel like drawing in ice. Suddenly, the shadowy figure appeared. Unlike the vague shape from his previous dream, this time Ethan could make out more details. It stood impossibly tall, its limbs too long and thin to be human. Its body seemed to shift and ripple like smoke caught in a breeze, but its form never quite dissolved completely. Where its face should have been, there was only darkness except for its eyes. They burned a fierce, vivid red, cutting through the gloom like hot coals. In its arms, it cradled Olivia. The baby looked so small against the creature's towering form, wrapped in her pink blanket just as she had been at the hospital. The figure bent its head toward her, whispering words in a language that made Ethan's ears hurt, sounds that seemed to slither and crawl through the air. Ethan tried to step forward to reach for his sister, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if they had become part of the forest floor itself. The figure slowly turned its burning gaze toward him, and when it spoke, its voice resonated like distant thunder. "She belongs to us now." "What do you mean? Who are you?" Ethan tried to shout, but his voice came out weak and trembling. He struggled against whatever force held him in place, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The figure began to fade into the shadows, taking Olivia with it. Her cries grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely, leaving only the sound of Ethan's ragged breathing in the oppressive silence of the forest. The terror finally broke through, and Ethan screamed himself awake. His pajamas clung to his skin, soaked with cold sweat, and his blankets were twisted around his legs like restraints. His scream echoed through the quiet house, followed quickly by the sound of running footsteps. His bedroom door burst open and his father appeared in the doorway, disheveled and alarmed. "Ethan, what's wrong? Are you okay?" Ethan tried to speak, to explain what he had seen, but the words caught in his throat. It felt real. He finally managed to whisper, his voice shaking. It wasn't just a dream. From somewhere in the house, Olivia's cries began again, the same haunting sound he had heard in the forest, echoing through the hallways like a chilling reminder of the shadowy figure's words. Morning light filtered through the nursery window as Ethan's father stood rigid beside Olivia's crib, his face twisted with concern and anger. His fingers traced the edges of a strange symbol carved into the white wooden rail, an intricate design of sharp angles and swirling patterns that seemed to catch the sunlight in an unsettling way. "Ethan!" his father called out, his voice sharp with frustration. "Come in here right now!" Ethan shuffled into the nursery, his stomach dropping when he saw his father's expression. The moment his eyes fell on the symbol, something stirred in his memory, a fleeting sensation of familiarity that made his skin prickle. "Did you do this?" His father pointed at the marking. "Tell me the truth." "No," Ethan protested, his voice cracking. "I wouldn't damage Olivia's crib. I didn't do it." "Then how did it get here? This wasn't here yesterday." His father's patience was wearing thin. First the strange behavior, then the nightmares, and now this? "You don't understand," Ethan said, his words tumbling out in desperation. "The dreams? They're trying to tell me something. There's this forest and this tall shadow thing, and it has Olivia. The symbol. I think I've seen it before. In the dreams." His father ran a hand through his hair in exasperation. "Ethan, enough. These dreams are just dreams. Your imagination is running wild and now you're damaging furniture?" "What's going on?" Ethan's mother appeared in the doorway, drawn by the rising voices. Her eyes widened at the sight of the symbol. "Look at this," his father gestured. "And now he's talking about dreams and shadows again." "I'm telling the truth," Ethan insisted, stepping closer to the crib. The symbol seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain, drawing him in. "Something's wrong with Olivia. Grandma feels it too." His mother moved between them, placing a gentle hand on his father's arm. "Let's all calm down. Maybe we should—" A cry cut through the air, sharp and piercing, unlike any sound a normal baby should make. It wasn't just loud, it seemed to slice through the very atmosphere of the room. Everyone froze, the argument forgotten as Olivia's unnatural wail filled the space. Ethan watched his parents' faces, saw the flicker of uncertainty cross their features. His mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for Olivia, and his father's skeptical expression wavered. When the crying subsided, the silence felt heavy with unspoken fears. Ethan's parents exchanged worried glances before his father muttered something about making coffee. They retreated to the kitchen, their hushed voices carrying through the house. Alone in the nursery, Ethan crept back to the crib. The symbol seemed to call to him. Hesitantly, he reached out and touched the carved lines with his fingertips. A faint glow emerged beneath his touch, sending shivers up his arm and through his entire body. For a brief moment, he felt as if he could sense the shadowy forest from his dreams, lurking just beyond the walls of reality. Gasping, Ethan yanked his hand back, his heart pounding. Whatever was happening, whatever had taken his real sister, he knew he had to find out the truth. Ethan's hands trembled as he set up the old camcorder on his grandmother's wooden tripod. The device was bulky and outdated, but its red recording light glowed steadily in the dimness of the nursery. He adjusted the angle carefully, making sure it captured the entire crib where Olivia lay sleeping. "Please show them," he whispered to himself. "Show them I'm not crazy." The night passed slowly. Ethan barely slept, checking the camcorder periodically to ensure it was still recording. When morning finally arrived, he retrieved the device with shaking hands and retreated to his room. Sitting cross-legged on his bed, Ethan connected the camcorder to his small TV. The footage started normally enough, just Olivia sleeping peacefully in her crib, the nightlight casting soft shadows on the walls. But as he fast-forwarded through the hours, his breath caught in his throat. Around 2 a.m., Olivia's eyes opened, emanating a faint otherworldly glow that illuminated the bars of her crib. The light pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. Then, objects around her began to move. Her mobile, hanging still in the windless room, started to spin slowly, its tiny animals casting strange shadows. A pacifier on the side table vibrated, inching closer to the edge before falling with a soft thud. Most disturbing was the whispers. They started as a low hum but grew clearer, not quite words, but definitely voices, speaking in tones that made Ethan's skin crawl. The crib itself seemed to respond, the bars trembling slightly as if in fear. "Mom, Dad," Ethan called out, his voice cracking. "You need to see this." His parents entered his room, exchanging worried glances. His father's skeptical expression remained fixed as Ethan rewound the tape, but it quickly dissolved as the footage played again. That can't be real," his father muttered, leaning closer to the screen. "It must be a trick of the light, or maybe the camera's malfunctioning." "The camera's fine," Ethan insisted. "This is what I've been trying to tell you." His mother sat heavily on the edge of Ethan's bed, her face draining of color as she watched the glowing eyes and moving objects. When the whispers started again, she pressed her hands to her ears. "Turn it off," she whispered. "Please just turn it off." But his father continued watching, his jaw clenched tight. The footage showed more objects shifting, a picture frame tilting on the wall, the curtains swaying without a breeze. Finally, he reached out and pressed the stop button, his hand visibly shaking. "We need to figure out what's going on," he muttered, his face pale and set. Ethan looked to his mother, who sat trembling, her eyes darting toward Olivia's room. The sense of safety they'd always felt in their home had vanished, replaced by a heavy dread that seemed to settle over them like a thick blanket. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Charlie's bedroom as Ethan paced back and forth, trying to find the right words to explain everything. Charlie sat cross-legged on his bed, listening intently as Ethan recounted the strange events of the past few weeks. "I know it sounds crazy," Ethan said, running his hands through his hair. "But you have to believe me. The video footage proves something's wrong with Olivia." Charlie leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "I don't think you're crazy, Ethan. Weird stuff happens all the time that science can't explain. Let's look into it." They started their research on Charlie's old desktop computer, the fan whirring loudly as they opened multiple tabs. Charlie typed "changeling babies" into the search bar, while Ethan flipped through some old folklore books they'd borrowed from the library. "Look at this," Charlie said, pointing to his screen. "There's whole forums dedicated to people who've had similar experiences. Parents reporting their babies acting strange with glowing eyes and weird noises." Ethan peered over his shoulder, scanning the posts. His heart raced as he recognized the patterns, the unusual cries, the unsettling awareness, the mysterious symbols. One account particularly caught his attention. A mother in Vermont describing how her baby's mobile would spin on its own at night. "Here's something," Ethan said, his finger tracing lines in a dusty book. In 1847, a family in Massachusetts reported their baby daughter changed overnight. They found strange markings carved into their door frames and furniture. The baby disappeared 3 months later. Charlie pulled up more historical accounts. Case after case showed the same pattern. Strange behavior, unexplainable phenomena, mysterious symbols, and then disappearance. The boys worked through the afternoon, piecing together the puzzle. "Wait," Charlie said suddenly, clicking on an old newspaper article. "This family in 1892, they found symbols just like the one in Olivia's crib. According to this, the marks are like a countdown. Once they appear, the takers are coming to claim the child permanently." Ethan's stomach dropped. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It doesn't say exactly, but none of the accounts mention babies lasting more than a few months after the marks appeared." They sat in the dim glow of the computer screen, surrounded by stacks of old books. "We don't have much time," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "If the stories are true, they're going to take her, and we have to stop them." Ethan spread the old maps across his bedroom floor, their yellowed edges curling slightly. His fingers traced the outline of Blackthorn Woods, a sprawling forest on the outskirts of town that had always given him an uneasy feeling. Now he understood why. "Look at this," he said to Charlie, who sat beside him examining newspaper clippings. "Every single disappearance happened within a mile of these woods. And these markings here," he pointed to strange symbols sketched in the map's margins. "They're just like the one on Olivia's crib." Charlie leaned closer, squinting at the faded ink. It can't be a coincidence. Ethan shook his head, pulling his backpack closer. We need to go there. Tonight. He stuffed a flashlight, water bottle, and his father's old compass inside. Charlie fidgeted with his own backpack. Are you sure about this? Those woods. People say they're not right. I have to try, Ethan said firmly. For Olivia. The boys set out as the sun began to sink, casting long shadows across their path. Blackthorn Woods loomed before them, its ancient trees stretching toward the darkening sky like gnarled fingers. The moment they stepped past the tree line, an unnatural silence fell. No birds sang, no insects chirped. Their footsteps seemed too loud on the spongy ground, which felt oddly soft and yielding beneath their feet. This is weird, Charlie whispered, his flashlight beam dancing across the twisted trunks. Something pale caught Ethan's eye. He moved closer, his heart skipping when he recognized a tiny onesie snagged on a low branch. It was torn and weathered, but the pale pink fabric was unmistakable. They pressed deeper into the woods, finding more disturbing signs. A plastic rattle lay half buried in dark soil, its cheerful colors dulled by dirt. A trail of baby clothes, a sock here, a small sweater there, led them further in. Ethan's flashlight revealed the symbol from Olivia's crib carved into a nearby tree trunk. The edges looked fresh, the wood still pale where it had been cut. As they walked, they found more symbols, each one seeming more recent than the last. A faint cry echoed through the trees, making both boys freeze. It sounded just like Olivia's unnatural wail. Maybe we should go back, Charlie suggested, his voice shaking. Ethan felt the same fear, but the thought of Olivia kept him moving forward. We can't. Not now. They followed the crying, their flashlight beams cutting through the growing darkness. The woods seemed to press in around them, branches creaking overhead though there was no wind. Finally, they came upon an enormous tree, its trunk wider than any they'd seen before. An elaborate version of the symbol had been carved into its bark, the lines emitting a faint, otherworldly glow. The crying stopped abruptly, plunging the forest into absolute silence. Ethan watched in horror as the shadows around them began to move, in ways shadows shouldn't. We're not alone, Ethan whispered, gripping Charlie's arm. They both turned at the sound of rustling behind them. The rustling grew louder, and both boys stumbled backward as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was an old man, his body bent and wiry, wearing tattered clothes that seemed to blend with the forest shadows. His face was deeply lined, weathered by time and hardship, but his eyes burned with an intense clarity that made Ethan catch his breath. You boys shouldn't be here, the man said, his voice rough like bark. This is Taker territory. Charlie grabbed Ethan's sleeve, ready to run, but Ethan stood his ground. Who are you? Name's Amos, the old man replied, stepping closer. Been living in these woods for longer than you've been alive, and I know exactly what you're looking for. Ethan's heart pounded. You know about the Takers? Amos's expression darkened. Better than most. Had a baby sister once, just like you. He settled onto a fallen log, his eyes distant with memory. I was 8 when they took her. Replaced her with something that looked just like her but wasn't. Nobody believed me when I told them something was wrong. Charlie moved closer, his fear giving way to curiosity. What happened? One morning, the changeling was gone. My real sister, too. Amos's hands trembled slightly. Been searching these woods ever since, trying to understand their ways. Found bits and pieces of the truth, but never enough to face them directly. When Ethan described the symbol from Olivia's crib, Amos's face went pale. The summoning mark, he whispered. They use it to bind the changeling to the real baby's essence. It's how they maintain the connection between our world and theirs. The baby at my house, Ethan said, his voice breaking. It's not really Olivia, is it? Amos shook his head slowly. No, boy. Your real sister is somewhere in their realm. And if you don't act soon, they'll take the changeling back and sever the connection forever. Once that happens, he trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Reaching into his worn jacket, Amos pulled out a creased piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a detailed hand-drawn map of the forest's depths. "This might help you," he said, holding it out. "But be warned, what lies ahead isn't natural. The changeling won't leave willingly," he added grimly, "and neither will the takers." Back in his dimly lit house, Ethan crept into the nursery while his parents prepared dinner downstairs. The changeling that looked like Olivia lay in her crib, cooing softly. His hands trembled as he reached down to examine her more closely, remembering Amos's warnings about the taker's mark. Rolling up the sleeve of her tiny onesie, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There, on her forearm, was a mark that made his stomach twist. It looked like a bruise at first glance, but as he tilted her arm in the fading sunlight from the window, it shimmered with an otherworldly gleam. The pattern matched exactly the symbol carved into her crib. "Oh no," he whispered, his heart pounding. The next morning, Ethan rushed to find Amos at the edge of Blackthorn Woods, Charlie trailing behind him. When Ethan described the mark, the old man's face grew grave. "The taker's mark," Amos confirmed, running a weathered hand through his gray hair. "It means the connection between the changeling and your real sister is almost complete. Once it is, they'll take the changeling back to their realm and your sister will be trapped there forever. Can't we remove it somehow?" Charlie asked, his voice hopeful. Amos shook his head slowly. "The mark is permanent. Your only chance is to get the changeling to the forest before the connection is complete. They'll have to bring your real sister here to make the final exchange." Ethan and Charlie spent the afternoon in Charlie's treehouse, drawing up plans on scraps of paper. They discussed different ways to lure the changeling to the woods, but each idea seemed more impossible than the last. "Snap! Maybe we could tell your parents you're taking her for a walk," Charlie suggested. "They barely let me near her anymore," Ethan replied, crumpling another failed plan. "They think I'm jealous or something." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Ethan's shoulders. His sister's fate rested entirely in his hands, but his parents remained blind to the danger. Every time he tried to explain, they grew more concerned about his behavior, not the threat to Olivia. In his bedroom that evening, Ethan sat cross-legged on his bed, studying a sketch he'd made of the symbol. The graphite lines seemed to shimmer on the page, just like the mark on the changeling's arm. Down the hallway, Olivia's cries pierced the quiet house, but they didn't sound like normal baby cries anymore. They had taken on a mocking tone, almost like laughter. Ethan shivered, clutching the paper tighter. He knew he had no choice but to act, even if it meant facing the takers alone. The Matthews household descended into chaos over the next few days. What started as subtle disturbances grew into unmistakable signs that something was terribly wrong. Olivia's cries echoed through the house at all hours, their pitch rising to impossible heights that made the windows vibrate. One evening, as Ethan's mother prepared a bottle in the kitchen, every cabinet door suddenly flew open at once. Glass shattered on the floor as dishes tumbled from their shelves. She stood frozen, the bottle slipping from her trembling hands. Ethan's father tried to maintain his composure, but his facade cracked when the lights began flickering violently during Olivia's feedings. Books would slide off shelves without being touched, and toys would spin and move across the floor on their own. "It's just old wiring," he'd mutter, flipping the circuit breakers for the 10th time that week. But his hands shook as he did it, and dark circles formed under his eyes from lack of sleep. Desperate to make them understand, Ethan gathered his evidence one morning. He showed them the camcorder footage again, pointing out the glowing eyes and whispering sounds. He rolled up Olivia's sleeve to reveal the shimmering mark, which had grown darker and more defined. "Please," he begged, "you have to believe me now. This isn't normal. She's not Olivia." His father paced the living room, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "There has to be a logical explanation," he insisted, though his voice wavered. "Maybe we should have the house inspected for electrical problems." But Ethan's mother sat silent, staring at the mark on Olivia's arm. Her face had gone pale and her hands twisted nervously in her lap. "James," she whispered to her husband, "what if he's right? What if something really is wrong?" Their argument that night was the worst yet. Ethan lay in bed, listening to their voices rise and fall through the walls. "We need to get help," his mother cried. "Something isn't right with her." "She's our daughter," his father shouted back. "What kind of help are you suggesting?" We can't just... A door slammed suddenly, cutting off his words, then another and another until every door in the house was slamming open and shut in a terrible rhythm. Olivia's cry pierced through it all, more like a screech now than a baby's wail. Ethan pulled his pillow over his head, feeling more alone than ever. His parents were finally seeing the truth, but they were too scared and confused to help. He would have to save his real sister on his own. The house finally quieted, the silence hanging heavy and unnatural. Then, from the nursery, came a tremendous crash. Ethan sat bolt upright in bed, his heart pounding against his ribs. Time was running out. The Matthews house had become a battleground of supernatural forces. The once peaceful home now echoed with Olivia's constant wailing, a sound that seemed to pierce through walls and rattle windows. Lights flickered unpredictably, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls, and doors slammed shut with enough force to make picture frames tumble from their hooks. Ethan watched his father pace the living room, muttering about faulty wiring and old house settling. "We'll get an electrician in tomorrow," he insisted, though his voice trembled slightly as another light bulb buzzed and popped overhead. "And maybe a structural engineer. These old houses, they can have all sorts of problems." His mother sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She flinched at every unexpected sound, her eyes constantly darting toward the nursery. When Ethan entered the room, Olivia's screams suddenly quieted to a soft whimper. The moment he stepped away, they resumed with renewed intensity. "Did you see that?" Ethan's mother whispered. "She always stops when he's near. That's not normal, James." "She probably just recognizes her brother," his father snapped, but uncertainty clouded his face. Ethan retrieved the camcorder from his room, his hands shaking as he set it up to play. "Look again," he pleaded. "Really look this time." The footage showed Olivia's eyes glowing in the darkness, objects moving without being touched, and the strange whispering sounds that filled the nursery at night. "It could be a trick of the light," his father argued weakly, "or interference with the camera." "Then what about this?" Ethan carefully rolled up Olivia's sleeve, revealing the mark that now pulsed with a faint, sickly light. His mother gasped, reaching out to touch it before pulling her hand back in fear. "James, that's not a birthmark. That's not natural." "Of course it's natural," his father shouted, his composure finally cracking. "What else could it be? What are you suggesting?" The argument escalated, their voices rising over Olivia's renewed wailing. Books began flying off shelves, and a vase shattered against the wall. Ethan stood in the middle of it all, watching his family fall apart as the truth they'd been denying became impossible to ignore. "We need to do something," his mother cried, ducking as a picture frame sailed past her head. "Like what?" his father demanded. "Call an exorcist? A ghost hunter? Be reasonable." Suddenly, every light in the house began to flicker rapidly, creating a strobe-like effect that made the room feel like a nightmare come to life. Then, with a loud pop, the entire house plunged into darkness. In the silence that followed, Olivia's cries transformed into something inhuman, a deep, guttural sound that made everyone's blood run cold. "We're out of time," Ethan whispered into the darkness. The night air hung thick and heavy as Ethan crept down the hallway toward Olivia's nursery. His bare feet made no sound on the wooden floors, though his heart hammered so loudly he feared it might wake the entire house. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, moonlight spilling across the room in pale streams. Olivia lay in her crib, unnaturally still. Ethan's hands trembled as he withdrew the small pair of scissors from his pocket. Each step closer to the crib felt like moving through molasses, his muscles tense with fear and determination. The changeling's dark hair gleamed in the moonlight as Ethan carefully lifted a small lock. Just as the scissors closed around the strands, Olivia's eyes flickered open. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as those eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, like twin embers in the darkness. Time seemed to stop as he stood frozen, scissors still poised. But the changeling's eyes drifted closed again, and Ethan quickly secured the lock of hair in a small cloth bag. Later, in the forest clearing where they had agreed to meet, Charlie and Amos waited. Charlie paced nervously while Amos arranged items on a flat stone: candles, herbs, and an ancient-looking iron blade with strange markings etched into its surface. "The iron must never leave your hand during the ritual," Amos explained, his weathered face grave as he handed the blade to Ethan. "It's your only protection against their magic." Charlie carefully unwrapped an ornate mirror, its silver surface catching the moonlight. "My grandmother used this for protection," he said softly. "She always said it could reveal true forms." The three worked methodically, arranging the items according to Amos's instructions. Ethan placed the lock of hair in the center of their makeshift altar, while Charlie positioned the mirror to reflect the moonlight. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, branches hanging still despite the occasional breeze that stirred through the clearing. "Remember," Amos warned, his voice barely above a whisper, "the takers are ancient beings. They won't give up what they consider theirs without a fight." Ethan nodded, gripping the iron blade tightly. The weight of what they were about to attempt pressed down on him, but the thought of his real sister trapped somewhere in the taker's realm strengthened his resolve. They made their way deeper into the forest, following Amos's lead. The burlap bag containing their ritual items bumped against Ethan's leg with each step. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, as they approached their destination. Even Charlie, usually quick with a joke to lighten the mood, remained silent. Finally, they reached the massive tree Ethan remembered from his dreams. The symbol carved into its trunk pulsed with a faint, sickly light. As they began setting up the ritual items, arranging them in a precise pattern, Amos placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Once this begins, there's no turning back," the old man warned. Ethan looked down at the mirror, seeing his face distorted in its moonlit surface. Despite his fear, his voice was steady as he replied, "Let's do it." The ritual began as the moon reached its apex. Ethan's hands shook slightly as he arranged the items in a precise circle around the ancient tree, just as Amos had instructed. The iron blade lay cold against his palm while he worked, its weight a constant reminder of the protection it offered. "Speak the words clearly," Amos whispered, his weathered face tense with concentration. "Don't hesitate or stumble." Ethan took a deep breath and began reciting the ancient incantation. The strange syllables felt heavy on his tongue, each word seeming to hang in the air after he spoke it. As his voice carried through the clearing, the temperature plummeted. Charlie huddled closer, his breath visible in the sudden cold. The symbol carved into the tree began to pulse with an eerie light, casting strange shadows that seemed to writhe and dance across the forest floor. The darkness between the trees deepened, becoming almost solid. Even the moonlight appeared to dim, as if retreating from what they had summoned. A figure emerged from the shadows exactly as it had appeared in Ethan's dreams, but far more terrifying in reality. It towered over them, its limbs impossibly long and fluid, moving in ways that defied natural law. Its red eyes burned like hot coals in the darkness, fixed intently on Ethan. "You dare summon us, child?" The voice resonated through the clearing, a deep, rasping sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The words vibrated in Ethan's chest, making his ribs ache. "Do you even know what you ask?" Despite his terror, Ethan gripped the iron blade tighter and stood his ground. "I want my sister back," he declared, proud that his voice remained steady. "The real Olivia." The taker circled them slowly, its movements fluid like smoke. Charlie pressed closer to Ethan, while Amos watched with grim determination, his hand clutching a protective charm. The creature's presence felt wrong, as if reality itself rejected its existence. "Such bravery," it mocked, its red eyes gleaming with dark amusement. Or perhaps foolishness. It completed another circle around them, each step bringing with it a wave of cold that made Ethan's bones ache. Finally, it paused, regarding them with what seemed like curiosity. "Very well, but all things come at a cost." The taker moved closer, its burning gaze locked onto Ethan. The boy could feel the ancient power radiating from the creature, cold and hungry and patient. Its voice dropped lower, becoming almost intimate as it pronounced, "If you wish to save your sister, you must offer something of equal value." The taker's words hung in the air like frost, and Ethan felt their weight pressing down on him. His mind raced as he considered what something of equal value might mean. The creature's red eyes seemed to peer into his very soul, searching for weakness. "Your memories are strong, child," the taker whispered, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "One particularly shines bright within you. That is our price, your most precious memory, completely erased." Ethan's heart clenched as he instantly knew which memory the taker meant. The warm summer day at Lake Morrison with his grandfather flooded his thoughts. He could still feel the rough wooden dock under his feet, smell the earthy scent of worms and lake water, and hear his grandfather's patient voice teaching him how to cast the line just right. It was the last perfect day they'd shared before his grandfather passed away. The memory had carried him through countless difficult nights, serving as a reminder that he was loved, that he was capable, that he mattered. When school got tough or when he felt alone, he would close his eyes and return to that peaceful afternoon by the lake. Charlie shifted uncomfortably beside him, while Amos remained still, his expression heavy with understanding. The old man knew the true weight of such a sacrifice. Memories were the anchors that kept people whole. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he grappled with the choice before him. The thought of losing that precious memory felt like losing his grandfather all over again. But then he thought of Olivia, his real sister, trapped in whatever dark realm the takers inhabited. How could he choose his own comfort over her freedom? "Take it," Ethan said, his voice cracking with emotion. He swallowed hard and repeated more firmly, "Take it. Just give me my sister back." The taker's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like shards of ice in the darkness. It raised one long, shadowy hand toward Ethan's forehead. "The bargain is struck," it hissed. Pain shot through Ethan's head as the creature began its work. The memory of that perfect day started to blur at the edges, like a photograph slowly dissolving in water. His grandfather's face became less distinct. The sound of his laugh grew fainter. The feelings of joy and security began to slip away. "Your sister is nearly free," the taker whispered, its eyes glinting with an unsettling light that suggested something was terribly wrong. The night air crackled with supernatural energy as Olivia's cries pierced through the darkness. The changeling's wails grew more intense, transforming from infant sounds into something utterly inhuman. A high-pitched screech that made Charlie cover his ears and Amos take a step back. In the ritual circle, the changeling's form began to twist and contort unnaturally. Its baby-like features melted away, revealing something ancient and malevolent beneath. Its eyes glowed with the same red fire as the taker's, and its tiny fingers elongated into sharp, grasping claws. Without warning, the creature lunged at Ethan, its movements impossibly fast. Charlie shouted a warning, but Ethan barely managed to stumble backward, feeling the rush of air as those claws swept past his face. The taker's laughter echoed through the trees, cold and cruel. "Did you truly think we'd let her go so easily?" it mocked, clearly enjoying Ethan's shock and fear. Ethan's mind raced as he dodged another attack from the changeling. His grandfather's memory was already growing dim, but something else surfaced in his thoughts. Amos's words from earlier that day. "The takers are bound by ancient rules. They cannot break a bargain once struck." Taking a deep breath, Ethan straightened his spine and faced the taker directly. "You broke our deal," he declared, his voice stronger than he felt. "We made a bargain. My memory for my sister. You're bound by that agreement." The taker's form flickered like a candle in the wind, its confidence wavering for just a moment. That brief hesitation told Ethan everything he needed to know. He'd found a weakness. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed the iron blade from the ritual circle. The metal hummed with power in his grip, and he slashed through the air, cutting the invisible threads of energy that bound the taker's ritual together. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The changeling's shriek turned to one of pain as its form began to collapse in on itself. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the trees around them swayed dangerously, their branches creaking like old bones. "You dare?" the taker hissed, its form becoming less substantial with each passing second. "Return my sister," Ethan demanded, holding the iron blade steady, "or I'll destroy your connection to our world completely. You know I can do it. The ritual is already breaking apart." The forest continued to quake, leaves falling like rain around them as the supernatural energy that had built up began to unravel. Charlie stood beside Ethan, gripping his friend's shoulder in support, while Amos watched with a mixture of fear and pride as his young student turned the tables on the ancient being. In the midst of the chaotic forest, Charlie's eyes widened as he caught sight of something extraordinary in the moonlit mirror. The taker's reflection revealed something entirely different from its imposing presence, a withered, grotesque form that seemed to twist and writhe unnaturally. "Ethan, look at this!" Charlie called out, his voice trembling with excitement and fear. "The mirror. It shows what it really is." The reflection showed a creature that barely resembled anything human. Spindly limbs bent at impossible angles, paper-thin skin stretched over hollow bones, and eyes that were more like empty voids than the burning red orbs they appeared to be. Ethan glanced at the mirror and immediately understood its significance. The taker wasn't the powerful entity it pretended to be. It was something far more fragile, hiding behind an illusion of strength. The taker realized what they'd discovered and let out a bone-shaking roar of fury. The trees around them swayed violently, and shadows began to writhe and stretch like living things, reaching for the boys with sharp, clawing tendrils. Amos moved swiftly, the iron blade flashing in his hands as he cut through the attacking shadows. "Hold the mirror steady," he shouted, positioning himself between the boys and the darkness. "Don't let it hide from its true form." Charlie adjusted his grip on the mirror, angling it to catch the taker's reflection more clearly. Each time the creature caught sight of itself, it seemed to shudder and weaken, its imposing form flickering like a bad television signal. Ethan saw his chance. Using the mirror's reflection to track the taker's real movements rather than its illusions, he darted forward with the iron blade. The metal sang through the air, and this time it struck true. The taker's scream was unlike anything they'd heard before, a high, thin sound of genuine pain. The creature's form began to unravel at the edges, wisps of shadow peeling away like smoke in a strong wind. Charlie kept the mirror focused on it, forcing the taker to confront its true appearance again and again. Each glimpse seemed to cause it physical pain, making its form even more unstable. "Keep it up," Amos called, continuing to slash through the shadow tendrils that tried to overwhelm them. His movements were precise and practiced, the iron blade leaving trails of light in its wake. The taker tried to retreat, but Charlie tracked it with the mirror, refusing to let it escape the truth of its reflection. Its once mighty presence diminished with each passing moment, its fearsome appearance cracking and peeling away to reveal more of the pathetic creature underneath. Stumbling backward, the taker's body began to twist and contort, unable to maintain its fearsome illusion. For the first time since they'd encountered it, real fear showed in its eyes, not the kind it used to intimidate others, but genuine terror at being exposed. Ethan stood his ground, holding the iron blade steady as Charlie kept the mirror raised. The reflective surface seemed to glow brighter, as if drawing power from the taker's weakness. The creature's cries echoed through the forest, no longer commanding but desperate and afraid. "You're not invincible," Ethan declared, tightening his grip on the iron blade, his voice steady despite his racing heart. A soft, ethereal glow caught Ethan's attention through the dense trees. Like a will-o-wisp, it beckoned them deeper into the forest. Amos and Charlie followed close behind as they pushed through thick underbrush toward the source of the mysterious light. The trees opened into a small clearing, and there, suspended between two ancient oaks, hung a translucent cocoon. It pulsed with gentle light, casting shifting shadows across the forest floor. Through its cloudy surface, Ethan could make out a tiny form, his real sister sleeping peacefully within. His heart leaped at the sight of her, but dread quickly followed as the air around them grew heavy with malevolent energy. The taker's form writhed with fury, and the changeling's eyes blazed with an unnatural light. "Hurry, Ethan!" Charlie called out, raising the mirror as the taker's shadows began to twist and stretch toward them. Ethan rushed forward with the iron blade, but before he could reach the cocoon, the changeling launched itself at him with inhuman speed. Its once infant form had transformed into something feral and wrong, with 2 long limbs and razor-sharp claws. Amos swung his blade in a wide arc, keeping the taker's shadows at bay as they lashed out like whips. "Get to your sister," he shouted, his weathered face tight with concentration. Charlie maintained his grip on the mirror, forcing the taker to confront its true reflection whenever it tried to advance. The creature hissed and recoiled each time, but its attacks grew more desperate and wild. Dodging the changeling's claws, Ethan reached the cocoon. He raised the iron blade, bringing it down hard against the ethereal surface. The material resisted, more solid than it appeared. Ethan struck again and again, but could only manage shallow scratches across its surface. Behind him, Charlie cried out as one of the taker's shadow tendrils caught his arm. The mirror wavered, and the taker pressed its advantage, surging forward. Amos jumped in front of Charlie, slashing through the shadows with his blade, but even his experienced movements were becoming sluggish with fatigue. The changeling circled around for another attack, its movements jerky and unnatural. Ethan knew he was running out of time. Gripping the iron blade with both hands, he drove it hard into the base of the cocoon where it seemed thinnest. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the point of impact. Cracks spread across the cocoon's surface like spider webs, glowing with intense white light. From within, a baby's cry pierced the air. Not the unnatural wail of the changeling, but the pure, healthy cry of his real sister. The cocoon shattered, fragments of light scattering like stardust. Ethan caught his sister in his arms, cradling her carefully against his chest. Her cries echoed through the clearing, and for a moment, everything else fell silent. The taker's attacks, the changeling's snarls, even the whisper of wind through the trees. Then the taker's enraged roar shattered the peace, shaking leaves from the trees and sending vibrations through the ground beneath their feet. The taker's massive form towered over the group, its weakened state doing nothing to diminish the waves of fury radiating from its shadowy presence. Ethan looked down at his sister's innocent face. Her tiny fingers curled against his chest and knew what he had to do. With trembling legs but unwavering resolve, he stepped forward. "Take me instead," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "Let my sister go free and I'll give myself to you willingly." The taker's form rippled with interest, its red eyes fixing on Ethan with newfound intensity. It circled him slowly, like a predator assessing its prey. The shadows of its form brushed against Ethan's skin, leaving trails of ice-cold sensation in their wake. "A mortal willing to give up everything?" The taker's voice carried a mix of curiosity and malice. "Fascinating." "Don't do this," Charlie called out, his voice cracking with fear. "There has to be another way." Amos placed a restraining hand on Charlie's shoulder, his weathered face grave. "The boy makes his own choice," he said quietly, though his eyes reflected deep concern. The taker continued its circular path around Ethan, its voice taking on an almost contemplative tone. "I will accept your offer, child. The baby will be free." Its form solidified slightly as it spoke. "But know this, your essence will be marked. You will be forever bound to my realm, your soul tethered to the shadows." "Ethan, please," Charlie begged, taking a step forward. "You don't know what that means." But Ethan stood his ground, holding his sister closer. "I understand," he said to the taker. "Just promise she'll be safe." The taker's form condensed into a more humanoid shape as it approached Ethan. "So be it." Its cold hand reached out, touching Ethan's forehead with devastating gentleness. Pain exploded through Ethan's head as the mark seared into his skin. It felt like ice and fire combined, burning and freezing simultaneously. The air around them grew still and heavy, nature itself seeming to acknowledge the binding of the pact. The taker withdrew its hand, satisfaction evident in its glowing eyes. As promised, its shadowy tendrils retreated from the clearing, releasing their hold on the baby completely. The weight of the curse settled over Ethan like a heavy cloak, and his legs gave out beneath him. As he collapsed to his knees, Amos quickly stepped forward to take the baby from his arms. Charlie rushed to Ethan's side, dropping down beside him. The mark on Ethan's forehead pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. "What did it do to you?" Charlie asked, his voice shaking with fear and concern. The forest seemed different now as the group made their way through the twisted paths. Ethan's head throbbed where the mark burned, and strange sensations washed over him in waves. Shadows danced at the corners of his vision, taking forms that made his stomach turn. Whispers, barely audible but distinctly inhuman, echoed in his ears. Amos noticed Ethan's disorientation and slowed his pace. "You're experiencing the sight," he explained, cradling baby Olivia carefully. "The Taker's curse has linked you to their realm. You're seeing what most cannot." Charlie stayed close to his friend, steadying him when he stumbled. "What exactly are you seeing?" "Everything's wrong," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "The shadows move like they're alive, and I hear voices, crying." They picked their way carefully through the darkened woods. Amos led them along a winding path, avoiding areas where the shadows gathered too thickly. Ethan's new sight revealed glimpses of another world overlaying their own, a twisted dimension where everything was darker, colder, more malevolent. Through the trees, he caught fleeting images of grotesque creatures slithering between worlds. The sound of children crying echoed faintly from this other realm, making Ethan's heart ache. "There are others," he whispered. "Other children they've taken." "Focus on what's in front of you," Amos advised firmly. "The sight can overwhelm if you let it." Despite the horror of his new perception, Ethan felt a deep sense of relief whenever he looked at his sister sleeping peacefully in Amos's arms. Her tiny face was relaxed, untouched by the darkness that now colored his world. The price he'd paid seemed worth it just to see her safe. As they approached the forest's edge, the first hints of dawn lightened the sky. Amos paused, turning to Ethan with a serious expression. "The Taker's realm will always be with you now," he said gravely. "But so will your courage. Remember that in the dark times ahead." Charlie squeezed Ethan's shoulder supportively as they emerged from the forest. Ethan looked down at his sister, joy and sorrow mixing in his heart. The mark on his forehead tingled as a shadow passed across the brightening horizon. "It's not over," Ethan whispered to himself, holding his sister close. "But she's safe, and that's all that matters." The Matthews family gathered in their living room, the soft glow of evening lamps casting warm shadows that were nothing like the menacing darkness of the forest. Baby Olivia lay peacefully in her crib, her gentle coos and natural movements bringing tears of joy to her parents' eyes. Mrs. Matthews couldn't stop touching her daughter's tiny hands and feet, as if confirming again and again that she was real. Mr. Matthews sat heavily in his armchair, his usual composed demeanor softened by exhaustion and relief. "Ethan," he said quietly, "we need to understand what happened. All of it." Ethan settled onto the couch between his parents, feeling the weight of their attention. He started from the beginning, that first moment in the hospital when he knew something wasn't right. His voice grew stronger as he described his recurring dreams, the changeling's unsettling behavior, and the strange marks that appeared around the house. His mother gasped when he described meeting Amos and venturing into the forest. Mr. Matthews's hands clenched the armrests tightly as Ethan recounted his confrontation with the Taker. When Ethan explained about the mirror and the iron blade, his father's scientific mindset seemed to struggle, but he didn't interrupt. "I had to make a deal," Ethan said softly, touching the mark on his forehead. "It was the only way to save her." Mrs. Matthews broke down then, pulling Ethan into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry we didn't believe you," she sobbed. "You went through all of that alone." Mr. Matthews cleared his throat, fighting back his own tears. "Son, I was wrong. I should have listened." Ethan could see how much his parents were struggling to process everything. His father's eyes kept darting to the windows, checking the shadows. His mother's hands trembled slightly as she stroked his hair. Their world had been turned upside down, their sense of safety shattered by the knowledge that such supernatural forces existed. "It's okay," Ethan assured them, though he knew things would never be quite the same. "We don't have to talk about it anymore." The family moved to stand around Olivia's crib, watching her peaceful sleep. She reached out in her slumber, her tiny fingers wrapping around Ethan's finger. The simple gesture brought a smile to his face despite the mark's constant tingling on his forehead. His parents stood close, their grateful smiles masking the lingering fear and uncertainty in their eyes. Days melted into weeks as the Matthews family settled into their new routine. While his parents cooed over Olivia and life seemed to return to normal, Ethan felt himself drifting further away from them. The curse of the sight weighed heavily on him, manifesting in ways that made even simple moments feel surreal. During breakfast, shadows would dance at the corners of his vision, twisting into grotesque shapes before disappearing. In class, whispers from the Taker's realm would filter through, unintelligible words that made him shudder. These constant reminders of his connection to the dark world left him exhausted and on edge. The worst part was the void where his cherished memory should have been. Ethan would sit in his grandfather's old fishing chair, desperately trying to recall his face, his voice, the way he'd shown him how to bait a hook. But there was nothing, just an empty space that ached like a phantom limb. Sometimes he'd find himself reaching for the memory out of habit, only to encounter that painful absence. His parents noticed the change in him. They'd exchange worried glances when he pushed his food around at dinner or declined invitations to family game nights. Their attempts to draw him out were met with quiet shrugs or mumbled excuses. Even Charlie, who had witnessed everything, couldn't bridge the growing gap. During lunch breaks, his friend would try to engage him in their usual conversations about comics and video games, but Ethan's responses were distant and distracted. How could he explain that while they talked, he could see shadowy figures lurking behind unsuspecting classmates? That sometimes the cafeteria walls seemed to ripple with dark energy? The guilt of his sacrifice mingled with a deeper shame that part of him regretted giving up such a precious memory. He'd saved his sister. Shouldn't that be enough? But the hollow space in his heart where his grandfather's memory had lived continued to throb with loss. Ethan withdrew further into himself. When his mother asked about his day, he'd respond with single words. When his father suggested they go fishing, an activity that now felt like looking at a photograph with the subject cut out, Ethan would claim he had homework. Even baby Olivia's milestones, which should have brought joy, only reminded him of the price he'd paid for her safety. In his room, Ethan sat cross-legged on his bed, staring at the ritual mirror they'd used in the forest. Its surface rippled slightly, showing glimpses of a darker world superimposed over his own reflection. Dark shapes moved in the background, their eyes gleaming with recognition. They knew him now, marked as he was by their master. "Will I ever feel normal again?" he whispered to his distorted reflection, the mark on his forehead tingling in response to the otherworldly visions. The visions began to bleed into Ethan's everyday life with frightening intensity. During math class, the fluorescent lights above flickered and dimmed, casting writhing shadows across his textbook. His body felt heavier with each passing day, as if invisible hands were trying to drag him somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold. Walking through the school hallways became an exercise in willpower. The lockers seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and sometimes he caught glimpses of red eyes peering at him through the metal slots. His classmates' voices grew distant and muffled, replaced by whispers from the Taker's realm. Unable to bear it alone any longer, Ethan trudged through the woods to Amos's cabin. The old hermit opened his door before Ethan could knock, as if expecting him. Inside, the cabin smelled of herbs and wood smoke, the walls lined with books about folklore and supernatural entities. "The curse is growing stronger," Amos said gravely, studying Ethan's pale face. "I can see it in your eyes, the way they drift to things others can't see." Ethan slumped into a worn armchair. "It's getting harder to resist. Sometimes I feel like I'm being pulled toward something. And the whispers, they're getting louder." Amos paced the small room, his weathered face creased with concern. "The Takers aren't finished with you, boy. The mark you bear, the connection you forged, it's made you valuable to them. They'll try to claim you, to draw you into their realm permanently." "But why?" Ethan's voice cracked. "They already took my memory. Isn't that enough?" "The Takers are creatures of appetite, always hungry for more." Amos placed a gnarled hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Your willingness to sacrifice yourself for your sister showed them your strength. They want that strength for themselves." The whispers in Ethan's head grew louder, as if responding to Amos's words. They promised relief from the constant strain, freedom from the weight of his loss. All he had to do was give in, let go, allow himself to be drawn into their world. Ethan gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. "How do I fight it?" "Stay anchored to this world," Amos advised. "Remember what you're fighting for. Your family, your sister, the very things the takers tried to destroy. Your love for them is stronger than any curse." But even as Ethan nodded, he felt the pull growing stronger. The shadows in the cabin's corners seemed to deepen, reaching for him with tendrils of darkness. His mark burned on his forehead, a constant reminder of his connection to their realm. Walking home from Amos's cabin, Ethan heard it. Soft, malevolent laughter carried on the wind. He turned slowly, his heart pounding, and saw them. Two gleaming red eyes watching him from the gathering dusk. His resolve hardened even as fear crept up his spine. Ethan found himself spending more time in Olivia's nursery, drawn to the peaceful atmosphere that surrounded his baby sister. The soft pink walls and gentle mobile music created a sanctuary from the dark visions that plagued him elsewhere. Here, watching Olivia's face light up with innocent joy, the shadows seemed less threatening. Unlike before, when the changeling had watched him with calculating eyes, Olivia's gaze held pure love and recognition. She would track his movements across the room, her tiny hands reaching for him whenever he came near. Her delighted giggles echoed through the house, chasing away the whispers that haunted him. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the nursery windows, Ethan sat in the rocking chair with Olivia cradled in his arms. She cooed softly, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb. In that moment, something remarkable happened. The ever-present darkness at the edges of his vision receded. The whispers that constantly echoed in his mind grew faint, replaced by the sound of Olivia's gentle breathing. "Hey there, little sister," he whispered, and her responding smile filled him with warmth. The mark on his forehead, usually burning with the taker's influence, cooled to a gentle tingle. It was as if Olivia's presence created a shield around them both, pushing back against the curse's hold. His mother noticed the change in him whenever he was with Olivia. She would stand in the doorway, watching them interact with tears in her eyes. "You're so good with her," she would say, encouraging him to spend more time with his sister. Though she couldn't understand the full significance, she sensed that these moments were healing something in her son. His father, too, supported their growing bond. He installed a comfortable reading chair in the nursery and bought books for Ethan to read to Olivia. During these reading sessions, Ethan's voice would grow stronger, the stories providing an anchor to this world rather than the other that tried to claim him. What his parents couldn't see was how Olivia seemed to understand exactly what Ethan needed. When the visions were at their worst, she would catch his eye and smile, as if saying, "I'm here. You saved me, and now I'm saving you." Her laughter became a lifeline, each giggle pushing back the darkness that threatened to overwhelm him. As Olivia rested in his arms that afternoon, her small hand pressed against his chest, Ethan felt truly at peace for the first time since the ordeal. The weight of the curse seemed lighter, manageable in a way it hadn't before. She giggled at something only she could see, and Ethan found himself laughing too, a real, genuine laugh that surprised even him. He kissed her forehead gently, whispering, "You're my reason to keep fighting." One crisp afternoon, Ethan and Charlie sat on the old tire swing in Charlie's backyard. The familiar creaking of the rope provided a steady rhythm as Ethan finally opened up about everything he'd been holding inside. "I can't remember his face anymore," Ethan said quietly, describing the void where his grandfather's memory used to be. "It's like trying to grab smoke. The harder I try, the more it slips away." Charlie listened intently, his usual playful demeanor replaced by genuine concern. When Ethan described the whispers and shadows that followed him, Charlie didn't laugh or dismiss them. Instead, he squeezed Ethan's shoulder and said, "Then we'll make new memories, better ones." Together, they crafted a plan. They would visit their favorite places, try new adventures, and focus on creating moments worth remembering. Charlie pulled out a notebook and started listing ideas, from camping in the backyard to learning how to skateboard. At home, Ethan began spending more time in the kitchen with his mother, learning to bake cookies that filled the house with warmth and sweetness. His father taught him how to fix the old radio in the garage, their hands working together as they solved each mechanical puzzle. These simple moments helped anchor Ethan to the present, pushing back against the darkness that lingered at the edges of his vision. Olivia became central to their family activities. Ethan would hold her while his mother read stories, her tiny giggles punctuating each funny voice their mother made. During weekend picnics in the backyard, he would lay her on a blanket and watch her reach for floating dandelion seeds, her joy pure and infectious. Charlie kept his promise, showing up regularly with new ideas for adventures. They explored the creek behind the school, built elaborate blanket forts, and spent hours at the park inventing new games. Each experience added a fresh layer of happiness to Ethan's life, slowly filling the void left by his lost memory. Though the curse remained, shadows still danced in his peripheral vision, and whispers sometimes broke through the quiet. Ethan found strength in these new connections. The weight of his sacrifice felt lighter when balanced against the laughter of his sister, the support of his friend, and the love of his family. At the lake where they often went after school, Ethan and Charlie skipped stones across the water, competing to see who could get the most bounces. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, its warmth touching Ethan's face. For the first time since the ordeal, he felt a genuine smile spread across his face. "I can do this," he said, looking out over the water. "I can make new memories." The whispers came stronger that night, filling Ethan's room with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. He sat up in bed, watching shadows twist and writhe in the corners of his bedroom like living things. The Taker's presence felt bolder, more demanding than ever before. Moonlight filtered through his window, catching the edge of the mirror they'd used in the forest. It sat propped against his desk, alongside the iron blade carefully wrapped in cloth. These tools had helped him save Olivia, and now they might be his only hope of breaking free from the curse. Amos's warnings echoed in his mind. The Taker's mark will grow stronger until it consumes you entirely. Looking at his reflection in the mirror, Ethan could see the faint glow of the mark on his forehead. He knew what he had to do. Moving quietly through the dark house, Ethan gathered the mirror and blade. From his pocket, he pulled out a small vial of salt Amos had given him for protection. The old man's words rang clear. Salt purifies, cleanses. It can create a barrier between our world and theirs. As Ethan slipped out the back door, a familiar voice called out softly, "You weren't going to leave without me, were you?" "Yeah." Charlie stepped out from behind the garden shed, his face set with determination. "I'm coming with you." Ethan started to protest, but Charlie cut him off. "Don't even try. We're in this together." They made their way through the sleeping neighborhood to the edge of the forest. Amos waited for them by the ancient tree where everything had started, his weathered face grave in the moonlight. "The ritual must be precise," Amos explained, drawing symbols in the dirt with his walking stick. "Hold the mirror toward the Taker while driving the iron blade into its reflection. This will sever your connection, but—" He hesitated, looking at Ethan with concern. "The process will expose you to the full force of its power. The risk to your life is great." The forest around them began to stir, branches creaking and leaves rustling without wind. The Taker's rage filled the air, making it thick and hard to breathe. Shadows stretched toward them like grasping hands as the Taker materialized, its true form revealed in all its grotesque glory. Charlie's hands shook slightly as he held the mirror steady, but his voice was firm. "I've got you, Ethan." Amos began chanting in an ancient language, creating a protective circle around them with the salt. The Taker screamed in fury, its form twisting and stretching as it tried to maintain its hold on Ethan. Gripping the iron blade tightly, Ethan faced the mirror. The Taker's reflection showed its true, vulnerable form, a withered, desperate thing clinging to power it had stolen. With all his strength and courage, Ethan drove the blade into the reflection. The Taker's howl of agony shook the trees. Its form began to fracture like breaking glass, pieces of shadow and malice scattering into the night air. A pulse of energy exploded outward, knocking Ethan off his feet and sending him sprawling onto the forest floor. As the taker's screams faded into the wind, the oppressive energy that had haunted the forest lifted. Amos helped Ethan stand on shaky legs, while Charlie grinned through his obvious relief, clasping Ethan's shoulder supportively. Together, the three began their walk back to the house under a sky filled with countless stars, leaving behind a forest that was finally still and silent. The Matthews house felt different the moment Ethan stepped through the door. The oppressive weight that had lingered in every corner had vanished, replaced by a gentle peace that seemed to settle over everything like a warm blanket. Upstairs, Olivia slept soundly in her crib, her breathing steady and natural. The soft nightlight cast a gentle glow across her face, unmarred by any supernatural shadows. His parents met him in the hallway, their expressions shifting from concern to relief as they sensed the change in the atmosphere. The heaviness that had burdened their shoulders for weeks had lifted, leaving them standing taller, lighter. "Something's different," his mother whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Ethan explained about the ritual, about facing the taker one final time. Though his parents struggled to understand the supernatural elements, they recognized the courage it had taken. His father pulled him into a tight embrace while his mother wrapped her arms around them both. "We're so proud of you," his father said, his voice thick with emotion. In the days that followed, the house came alive again with the sounds of family life. Laughter echoed through the rooms, replacing the eerie whispers that had haunted them for so long. Olivia's giggles became a constant melody, bright and pure, filling the spaces where darkness had once lurked. Ethan spent hours with his sister, watching her discover the world with innocent wonder. Sometimes he caught glimpses of shadow creatures at the corners of his vision, but they were faint now, like old photographs fading in the sun. They no longer held any power over him. Charlie visited often, bringing video games and comic books, insisting they plan adventures for the summer ahead. "We're going to make so many awesome memories," he declared, his enthusiasm infectious. "Better ones than before." Amos stopped by occasionally, his weathered face creasing with approval as he observed the family's recovery. "Not many would have had the strength to face what you did," he told Ethan during one visit. "You showed remarkable courage." The family gathered more frequently for meals, movie nights, and quiet evenings together. The tension that had strained their relationships melted away, replaced by a deeper appreciation for each other. Ethan's parents made an effort to listen more openly, to understand rather than dismiss. Sitting beside Olivia's crib one evening, Ethan watched his sister reach out with her tiny hand. Her fingers wrapped around his with surprising strength, and she smiled up at him with pure love and trust. The void in his heart, where his grandfather's memory had been, began to fill with something new. Not a replacement, but a different kind of joy. "You were worth everything," he whispered to her, and meant it with all his heart. For the first time since his ordeal began, Ethan felt truly free of its weight, ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. If you enjoyed the story of Ethan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.